talking a little bit more about sort of the nexus of pollinator research and restoration within the Indiana Indians. I just want to point out, this is what I call the punk rock bee. This is a really, you'll see a series of these photos that with sort of the black background, and these were all taken mostly by the United States Geological Survey bee monitoring group, and they just have mastered this photography, and so hopefully you can enjoy these jewels of bees. Just wanted to start with a little bit of background on pollinators, just as a reminder of their importance. It's estimated that 1 in 3 bites of food that you eat is produced through the work of pollinators. 35% crops worldwide. That definitely equals a lot of financials, money, big impact on the economy as well. I think these numbers are probably outdated now. It's probably even more now. But we're also interested in pollinators because they, much like wild rice, they are ecological keystone species. 85% of flowering plant species require an animal, mostly an insect, to pollinate them. And one of the things that we've noticed through different studies is that when pollinators decline, oftentimes insect pollinated plants also will decline. And so we really need to protect our pollinators if we want to protect the remainder of the ecosystem. In terms of direct benefits, insects can provide food directly for birds and other wildlife, as prey items, but also indirectly. And the plants that they're pollinating, that produces seeds and fruit. You've probably been hearing last year or two or so, competing with COVID and all the other news and going on these days in our world. You might have heard about the decline of insects and what that might mean. And indeed, especially with pollinators, it could have some pretty widespread repercussions. If we just want to look at pollinators, I'm going to show you this image here. This is based on a bee survey that was conducted in Illinois about 100 years ago, and then was resurveyed most recently, just in, I think, 2015. Now, don't worry about reading the small text on that. If you can just kind of make out the circles and the hatch marks, you'll be good. But basically what you're looking at here is that all those solid yellow circles, those represent a species of bee that existed in Illinois about 100 years ago and still exists today. When they've gone back and resurveyed those, they've been able to find those. The shadowy sort of hatch mark circles that you see, those are species that they found 100 years ago, but when they went back and surveyed for them, they're no longer there. And so in this particular study, in this area in Illinois, just next door, over 50% of the native bee species, they're gone. They've been extirpated from that historic range. Now, that doesn't mean that they've gone extinct. It just means they're no longer in that area. But if you were to repeat these surveys in different areas across the country, you'd see a similar pattern. Now, this is really concerning, not just because we want to conserve our bees, but again, also because of the cascade effects that these might have on our ecosystems. For instance, it's estimated 25 to 45% of these bee species are pollen specialists, meaning that they require a certain set of plant species to get their pollen for their nourishment and to feed their brood. And so when you eliminate the pollinators for some of those species, you're also going to have trouble finding something that can pollinate. And so we're seeing these entire systems really get disrupted. You've probably heard about the Carner blue butterfly, which was federally listed as an endangered species in 1992. Unfortunately, sadly, it was extirpated from the Indiana dunes. We had our last report was in 2014, and that was of 2 males. And While we're still looking, we are sad to report that it's most likely gone from the area. You've also probably heard about the rusty-patched bumblebee, which was recently listed as an endangered species in 2017. Now, we don't have any historic records of the rusty-patched bumblebee actually occurring in Indiana Dunes National Park, but there are records nearby in south of the park, in some of the counties just south of us. But it also was last reported in Indiana in 2002. So, there's a lot of different reasons why we might be seeing these pollinator declines. Researchers point to habitat loss and fragmentation, pesticide usage, parasites and pathogens, climate change. But there might be some other factors too, or it might be a combination of a lot of these different factors. Unfortunately, there's really just a limit. There's not a lot of information out there to make a lot of assumptions for a lot of these species. These are sort of these charismatic, larger species that you can see, and I like to call bumblebees like the megafauna of the bee world, and butterflies, the pretty birds of the insect world. But for a lot of the smaller species, like in Illinois, we don't really know enough about their historic status or their current status to make any determination. So the National Park Service has recognized that we can play a role in pollinator stewardship. We have a way that we, through a number of actions, including on-the-ground habitat restoration, which our previous speakers have presented, and so we want to reach out. We've come up with a strategy of kind of these four. This is a national strategy of these four different points, which involve stewardship, science, education and outreach, and community stewardship. And Laura did a great job kind of touching on the nexus of how some of these things work together, and we all work together to make these great things happen. Jennifer has been an incredible partner with the park, and she's also using science to inform her own conservation of work in wild rice. So as I'm not going to speak too much on the stewardship, but we have on the ground habitat restoration and enhancement activities, which Laura has discussed, that is specifically directed towards pollinators. We're also talking about how we can implement best management practices. So, after we restore these habitats, we want to know, how do we maintain them? What are the best things that we need to be doing to make sure that we're doing all we can for those pollinators? And that's where the science comes in. So that's really what I'm going to focus on right now, which is the second strategy. Science is important for informing those informing those management actions at the park, which a big part of which includes the habitat restoration work. So some of our questions really are, how can we best manage for conservation of pollinators at the park? That's kind of the ultimate question, right? Much like looking at our strategies, what is the vision that we want for pollinators, right? What is the desired future condition? Just like Jennifer is looking at, what is the desired future condition for wild rice? And we use science to try to address that. And we have some specific questions that we're trying to address, which I'm going to touch on a few of these today. Just sort of a quick sampling. We want to know how pollinator communities have changed over time. We are interested in if our habitat restoration efforts, are they being successful? What are we doing the right thing? We have some other questions like, do bees use corridors in fragmented landscapes? We have a very highly fragmented national park. And then, where can we get the sort of biggest bang for a buck? Are there specific habitats or sites that we should be targeting for restoration? And then finally, I'm going to talk about what are some of the future stressors that we're thinking about in terms of pollinators? What do we see coming in the future that we need to be preparing for? So I'm just going to focus on this first one, how native pollinators have changed. And just to give you kind of an overview of what we're talking about when we're talking about pollinators, we're going to focus on native bees because native bees are really the most important pollinators. They functionally in the ecosystem are the ones that are moving pollen the most. And at Indiana Dunes, we have over 200 species of native bees, which is an incredible amount. If you just compare that regionally, we have half of the diversity in all of Indiana. Half of the diversity occurs just in this little sliver, this area of Indiana Dunes. So that's really amazing. And we know that we have this diversity because based on research that first began by Noel Pavlovic and Ralph Grundell and some colleagues from the United States Geological Survey, who did some incredible work starting in about 2003 and did a whole lot of surveys. They looked at all across the park and had lots of transects, did lots of collections and found all these species. We didn't know what species occurred here until then. And one of the reasons that they determined that we have such this incredible diversity is because we have these unique habitat types. We have a diversity of plants, diversity of soils, and a diversity of climate. So all the things that makes Indiana Dunes great, we've got it here. So how have native pollinator communities changed over time? We're addressing this question by doing native bee surveys. We're monitoring long-term trends and looking at that baseline data that we had, and we're comparing it. We're comparing that historical data with what we're finding now. We also have some really great information on how past management actions, have occurred. We have this great information on vegetation that's been going on, all the different management actions such as prescribed burns, thinning of vegetation, removal of invasive species, all these things. And so we can look at those, all the management actions and look at how the bee communities have changed over time and really look at assessing that. Is it improving? Is it going down? Is it staying the same? Those are the questions we're looking at. So we're also looking at how, again, how the effects of our habitat restoration efforts are. And we're focusing a lot of our efforts in oak savanna because that's where a lot of the restoration has been. And so we can monitor the native bee community beforehand. So we have that historic data. And we also monitor the vegetation. And then we can also look at how it's changing. So we can continue to collect data during these restoration actions and then after, and then follow up. And so just to give you an example, again, this is would be an example of some pretty low quality oak savanna. You can see it's choked. There's bittersweet and probably honeysuckle. On the right side, there's lots of shrubs. It's not open. It's in terms of pollinator habitat, this is pretty poor. There's not a lot of floral resources for the pollinators. Now, if you compare that to these other photos, you can see that the canopy is much more open. There's a rich diversity of floral resources. The bees will be happy here. So what we do in terms of research is we can set up transects and kind of compare these different areas that we consider to be low quality and areas that we consider to be high quality. And we can continue to do surveys and see how that's changing. And so just to give you a quick example of how we do this, we set up these transects. So you can see down below these little pink triangles. Each one of these triangles represents this triad or a triplet of bowls. We use bowls with soapy water with different colors, and that's how we collect bees. And we set these out at very strategic locations where depending on what aspects of the habitat we're studying. And we collect the bees and we count them up, and we work with the University of Minnesota to help identify them to species level. And then we try to make some assessments. So in that particular area, for example, we're looking at this corridor between Miller Woods and West Beach, going through the Marquette Trail. And we can, as Laura and her crew continue to do this fantastic work where they're treating invasive species and they're planting native seeds for floral resources, we can see how the habitat changed and we can see how the pollinators are responding to that. So another one of our research questions that we're interested in is how bees are using corridors. So again, we have this highly fragmented landscape, and where we would love to have these huge areas of solid habitat, we want to know how bees are using, how important these sort of like skinny pieces might be to bees. And then again, we're wondering, should we be targeting some of those specific sites, or are there specific habitats that we want to be targeting? So in addition to our transects, so we're looking at this in another different way. We have over 100 points set up around the park, and to sample all different types of habitats. And so all those little dots, if you can see on that map, represent some places where we've got some of our sampling areas. And it's kind of funny because we quickly learned that if we were to try to do bee bowls at all these different areas, we just wouldn't have enough time. It would be way too laborious. It takes, an hour sometimes to get to a single site, because these are very far off trail, many of them. And so one way we decided we could do this is, well, we're going to monitor bee nesting behavior. So I'm showing you this slide because you might be out on a trail, and if you see if you see these bee bowls, you'll know what those are. Those are bowls for the study. If you see any of these nest type things right here, those also are part of the study. So we monitor those to see if we can collect these. And once we get our data there, we can assess how connected that habitat is. We're working with, this is a collaborative project with the United States Geological Survey. And so we can look at these things and look at these areas and assess them for all different habitat types, and assess what we consider to be connected or not. And that'll tell us, if these are important areas for restoration, or how bees are utilizing these corridors. So the last bit of projects I want to mention are the future stressors to pollinators. So we kind of know what we're doing now. We've got some restoration actions going on the ground, but what's coming down the line? And one of the things that we're really concerned about, especially for our forest bees, is something called beech bark disease. So beech bark disease is it's a fungus. It's carried by a scale insect, and it has infected a lot of trees up in Michigan, including at our national park, Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore and Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. And the problem with this is that it's causing it's got like a 99% mortality for beech trees. So it's a real problem in these forests. And while we don't have it at Indiana Dunes, we're concerned that it could be arriving here. And so what is happening when these trees die in the forest, in these beech and maple dominated forests, is it's opening up these huge canopy gaps, and it changes the understory of the vegetation. It puts up these like shrubbery thickets, and it can really be problematic. And that could have some repercussions, not just on a lot of different wildlife, but especially pollinators, which depend oftentimes on those spring ephemerals. And so we're doing some research at Indiana Dunes, as well as at these other parks, to understand what potential impacts it can. And then if beech bark does come to these places, and also in these other parks, and we want to begin restoring these forests, that'll tell us how best to go about doing that. Like, hey, we want to make sure we're getting these plants in there, because these are really important for the pollinators. Another project that was conducted by Rutgers University that involves a lot of national parks, including Indiana Dunes, is focusing just a general survey on bees of forests, and trying to understand a little bit more detail what are the plant pollinator associations are. Forest bees are particularly vulnerable to climate change. They have a very early season. If you go to Heron Rookery right now, you can probably see a lot of bees flying around, a lot of native bees, and they are exploiting those spring ephemerals. And if those spring ephemerals aren't there, that can be a problem. Or if the bees come up before the spring ephemerals are blooming, that can be a problem. So you can get these what we call phenological mismatches. So this is another study that should inform us how we can better restore forests that can support more climate resistant pollinator communities. And then another quick one to point out, we do a lot of collections where we collect bees. A lot of for bee species, you actually have to look at them microscopically to be able to identify them to that level. And that takes a lot of work. And so we're exploring new eDNA methods, which is led by the USGS. We're looking at how we can do that to understand better. So again, just to kind of summarize and come back to the pollinator strategic strategic plan, I want to finally point out, these other things with education and outreach, webinars such as this with the Dunes Learning Center. We are involved in Pollinator Week, Pollinator Trail coming soon to the Douglas Center, and demonstration gardens, all sorts of activities going on. And then that last plan is the community stewardship. This is not just the work that is happening within the park, but also alongside with our partners. So working with Shirley Hines, Save the Dunes, NIPSCO, and so on. And so they are all working on this GLRI pollinator project. So I just want to acknowledge the funding that we get through GLRI, and my research collaborators who have just done an incredible job on this, and too many people who have taken part in these adventures to name all. But thank you all.